All right. This is gonna be just I don't know what I'm gonna call this kind of video, but I'm gonna do more of these because at one point, one of you in the past, I remember what the hotel room I was in and everything the day I got this video. This question. One of you way back then had asked me a question about doing a video series on who my heroes are, which you've gotten a little taste of my heroes. That's the question I was asked. People I admire would be how I probably would have worded it, but whatever. And I don't remember how I handled it, but I remember that parts were flying around my head because sometimes my heroes are not well regarded in this world, and I don't really understand. I understand why, but I can, just like I told you people, had that war gone in a different direction, we'd be talking about Bloody Bill Sherman and all his war crimes. So I've decided that in this incarnation of me being out here, we are going to. I'm just going to beat the world to death with this now because you people decided to start ripping down statues of people I admire. So here we go. The truth be told, the first person that I would have told you was my hero or person I admire. In fact, the reason why I remember this so well is when I was a kid, I had to write a report for school in probably the 4th grade. And the report was the American I admire the most. And interestingly enough, I find it hilarious, especially that some teacher heard me read this fucking report to the class. Oh, that must have been funny too. But the person was Robert E. Lee. Now, I'm not going to get too into Robert E. Lee right now, just because the person who was my second hero was so fucking interesting that he is Robert E. Lee by leaps and bounds. In fact, this person was someone who Robert E. Lee admired. And I happen to know a lot more about this particular person than most people. We'll get into that. But my point here with this is, I'm going to do probably quite a few videos on this topic. So, this person is John Singleton Mosby, who you probably haven't heard of compared to Robert E. Lee. And basically, the premise of this is, who was John Singleton Mosby? He was a Confederate guerrilla, which, interestingly enough, it was Mosby that led. It wasn't the outlaw Josie Wales that led me to Missouri guerrillas. It was Mosby, and Mosby had no connection with Missouri guerrillas. The only connection that he had was that they were both guerrillas. When I was a kid, we used to go to Virginia, and we ended up going to Fairfax Courthouse, which I'm not going to discuss right now. Because if you look up anything to do with Mosby, Fairfax Courthouse is the biggest thing. And the thing I want to discuss about Mosby today is actually something that took place at the end of the war. And the reason why I'm starting here is it's a good estimation of what his men were capable of. There's only one other person this is like someone doing like a documentary. I'm just talking to my friends here. There's one other person did a video on this topic. That's the only reason why I want to start here, because it's such a great story. And this fellow, I guess, did a good job. He was actually there, meaning not at the battle, but he was at the battlefield talking about it. I got this information out of, I'm sorry to do this to you people, one of 2 books. I forget which book it was. I have every book that was written by anyone who rode with Mosby. And I think Mosby might have written a book that I don't have. I'll get it, but every time you look up his books, I just keep finding the same book I already have. Point being is, the story I'm about to tell you comes from one of these books. It's either by a guy named Williamson, I'm sorry, I forget his first name, or the book written by John Munson. And this story is about a specially tasked group of hand-picked men who were supposed to go out and hunt Mosby's men. So the best way to tell you this story is actually to rewind to the beginning of the war. Well, not the beginning of the war so much, but the beginning of Mosby's career as a guerrilla. An interesting side note, you've all heard of the greatest cavalier to ever live. Jeb Stuart. He used to have high schools and stuff named after him. And that's just not a catchy little title I put on him. Jeb Stuart, back in his day, and remember, we're talking the Civil War, not today. Jeb Stuart rode his entire cavalry around the perimeter of McClellan's army, which gave him world fame at the time. Now, he did this twice, but the second time was not as famous as the first. Now, the reason I'm telling you about this is the idea for going completely around McClellan's army came from one of his scouts, a guy named Mosby. So in April 21st of 1862, they passed the Partisan Ranger Act, and Jeb Stuart saw to it that Mosby became a Partisan Ranger, a guerrilla, basically, an official guerrilla, unlike a lot of the stuff that was going on in Missouri. Mosby worked in conjunction with the Army of Northern Virginia. He wasn't like a bandit or something. I don't know how else to put it, but a lot of bad shit was going on in Missouri on both sides. I don't really know how to describe it, but Mosby was the opposite of everything going on in Missouri. So this story I'm going to tell you, the reason I'm telling you, we're rewinding. At the beginning of the war, Mosby has this quote, and he said this so often that there's two different versions of this quote. Union cavalrymen would ride into battle with a cavalry saber slung high above their heads. My men would ride into battle with the reins in their teeth and a fine Colt revolver in each hand, emptying saddles at every jump. Those Union soldiers may as well have been armed with cornstalks. That's the quote. There's another quote. Those Union soldiers may as well have been armed with wooden swords. I believe he said both because I think he liked that quote. So let's see how fucking well the United States military learned. So this is the beginning of the war. Mosby makes this quote. Okay. So at the end of the war, towards the end, this is in 1865, and in fact, it was the last battle I believe Mosby's men took place in, and Mosby was not involved in this. I'll tell you how it happens. They pick 100 hand-picked men, and they specially arm them to hunt guerrillas. And they gave them, I believe, and you got to remember, all of this is just me working off of memory. And in fact, there's someone in the room right now who will be like, yeah, no, he's full of shit. No, this is just stuff I know. But I kind of forget what gun they were armed with, but they armed them with, I think, a Sharps carbine, which was, a cartridge thing, repeating, compared to a musket. They armed them with a cavalry sword and a revolver. So there's 100 of these men. They're under a guy named Captain Blazer. I believe he was a captain. Mosby's men. Oh, so these guys end up killing 2 of Mosby's men, and this infuriates Mosby. Which he was actually before the war he was a lawyer. He wasn't a very giving into his passions kind of person. But the way these men were killed very much upset him. I kind of forget the details of that. So he sends a letter to one of his subordinates. And it went blah, 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 all kinds of words. And the very last thing that it said, he was describing what had happened. The very last thing that was said in this letter was, annihilate them. So Mosby's command, 100 of them, went over into West Virginia, which is where this takes place. And my recollections of this are not as good as I wish they were, but I believe they split up. 2 of the 100 men got killed in a skirmish. They split up, and while Blazer's men were chasing the first half of Mosby's men, the second half rode in on their flank and just, as Mosby said, emptying saddles at every jump, rode right through them. So what ends up happening is 2 days later, 2 men show up at the Yankee camp, and they go to their commanding officer, and they salute him, and they say, Captain Blazer's command, sir. And the colonel, or whatever he was, looked at them and said, well, where are the rest of you? And they said, captured or killed, sir. He fucking wiped out the entire fucking command except for 2 people. And that is how phenomenal Mosby's Rangers were. They were the 43rd Virginia Cavalry. Another interesting point. I'm going to talk about this probably a lot once in a while, not all the time, but as things go by, we're going to go through Mosby, then we'll go through somebody else. But um, an interesting thing about Mosby's men, and in fact, if you read, this is a total opposite of the people in Missouri that I like. But Mosby's men, you could be in the heat of battle and just throw up your hands, and you got captured. And he must have instilled this into his men because even in their own writings, it's not specifically said, but it sounds like a mark of pride to them. Whereas Mosby would say, we lost 4 guys, 6 guys wounded, we captured 35 horses and 40 men, and we had to kill 4. And that's kind of the tone that he took towards it, like we had to kill. And that was a very big difference. Now, another interesting point, going back to Robert E. Lee, Mosby was there was a guy who did a study back after the war of all of Robert E. Lee's papers. And he wrote a letter to Mosby stating that his name went across Robert E. Lee's desk more than any single person, and it was always favorable. So, interestingly enough, well, this is a side point. Robert E. Lee had actually bumped into Mosby, and Mosby was on crutches because he was a guerrilla. He was always outnumbered, and so lead was always flying, and he would catch lead. So Mosby was on crutches, and Robert E. Lee walked up to him with another person, and he said, "Oh, Mosby, if I had 100 men like you, this war would be over in 2 months." Not an exact quote, maybe not exactly what he said, but that was the tone of what he said. And he looked at Mosby and he said, "If you'd only stop getting wounded," because every time he saw Mosby, he had gotten wounded. Mosby also got promoted up pretty damn fast, and I can't believe I got this deep into reminding you people. This guy's nickname was the Gray Ghost. So if you ever looking into stuff about the Civil War, when anyone talks about the Gray Ghost, they're talking about Mosby. Another interesting little fact, they used to take the planks off of the bridge going over the Potomac at night because they were afraid Mosby was going to sneak into Washington, D.C. and kidnap Lincoln. In fact, when Lincoln got shot, the first person that they fucking pinned it on was Mosby or one of his men. I'm going to give you guys next thing I do on this will be a bigger, more interesting story. But there's a lot of really interesting shit about Mosby. In fact, Mosby was the one in his book he talks about as a kid. He read The Life of Marion, Francis Marion. See what I'm saying? Like, that's the thing I like about old books, because then that led me down the road to that, which I wouldn't have thought of. But I guess we're going to leave it at that. So there is another really good fucking... In fact, Mosby's so cool, even people who don't like the Confederacy kind of have to fucking give him a nod, because Mosby... This isn't much about his guerrilla actions, but Mosby did some pretty fantastic shit for the time that he was doing it. World famous as a colonel. But yeah, also, Mosby was amongst the first people to be inducted into the Army Ranger Hall of Fame, and he was never in the Army. He was in the Confederate Army, but he was a lawyer before the war. And I'll give you another little second thing. When Mosby was an old man, he was the U.S. consulate to Japan, and he was also a lawyer for the railroads. And he used to go to a ranch in California, and he rode horses with the little kid that lived on the ranch, and he would reenact battles, like charges and shit with this little kid. You know what the little kid's name was? George S. Patton. So when Patton was a little kid, he rode with Mosby. Not legitimately. Interestingly enough, the guy he fought against, it was a high-ranking German officer who actually had ridden with Mosby, and he got wounded and went back. They thought he died. That guy, years later, and I forget this guy's name, it pisses me off. It's like some fancy fucking, like Von something type name. Anyway, he ends up in charge of the German cavalry in World War I. So a guy that rode with Mosby ended up fighting against a guy who was Mosby's friend and rode with Mosby. We'll get more of this later before I make this too long. All right. I hope you enjoyed this. Fuck you all.